Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, or if you're new to the channel, welcome to the video. My name is Solomon Thomas, and I'm a former Marine. I'm about to graduate with my master's in psychology, and I currently work with children with autism. And my goal in life is really to just become a better person, and one of the ways I'm trying to do that is by continuing to educate myself by reading philosophy and psychology and just trying to get experience with the world. One of the reasons I'm making these YouTube videos is to try to clarify my thinking and also to share these ideas with anyone if they resonate or perhaps could be helpful. So in today's video, I want to talk about the story of the Tower of Babel from the Bible, and I want to relate it to some current events that just recently happened. And these ideas are something that I've written about in my Substack, which you can find in the description below. There, it's an essay form, written form, so hopefully it's a lot more concise than what I try to convey here. But if you're interested, it's down in the link below. So the events in question are the recent UK Supreme Court ruling that a woman is a biological female. So that's the first event. And the second event is the US Supreme Court hearing in a Maryland-based case, where, from my understanding of the story, there are public schools in Maryland, elementary schools, that are teaching children about gender and sexuality, in some cases as young as the first grade. And up until this point, again, from my understanding, parents, particularly religious parents, could opt out of having their children taught this curriculum. And at some point, these parents were no longer able to opt out of that curriculum. And so legal cases were laid out, and the Supreme Court recently heard, I believe, testimonies from both sides. And so there are particulars of each of these events, but the overarching pattern is this question of sexuality and this question of particularly what it is to be a woman. But perhaps we could just say the broader question of sexuality. Now, how does that relate to the Tower of Babel? As a side note, I listen to a lot of Jordan Peterson and Ian McGilchrist and John Vervaeke, and so a lot of these ideas, they're not my own. Part of what I'm trying to do right now is be a vessel for a lot of these ideas and a lot of these patterns that I've been reading about, and my goal is just to try to distill them and present them in a way that makes sense for myself, but hopefully for other people. So a lot of these ideas are not my own. When it comes to the Tower of Babel, let me run through the story first and then try to relate it back. So the Tower of Babel starts off with, it's after the flood, it's after Cain and Abel, it's after Adam and Eve fall. So we have humans that are existing in a limited form. We're no longer in the Garden of Eden. And everyone is speaking the same language. Everyone's communicating. We're a community. We're a unified community. And we get the idea, we people, humans, we get the idea of building a city, and in that city building a tower that can reach to the heavens. And I can't remember the exact verbiage, but it's hinted at that the intention behind building this tower is to make a name for ourselves. I believe that's what is detailed in some translations. And I read that as a selfish intention. We want to reach the heavens to make a name for ourselves, not to please God, not to praise God, not to worship Him, but it's something very human. It's a desire of man, not necessarily a desire of God. So I think that's something that's important. And as we begin building this tower, God is displeased with this, and so He comes down and makes it so that we cannot speak to each other. So now we are speaking different languages, and I believe God also scatters humans across the earth. And one way to interpret that story, it could mean that when man when men try to reach for the sacred and take it unto themselves in a selfish manner, in a manner that's not in keeping with the will of God, then we will engage in conflict and be unable to understand each other and will become fractionated. So how does that relate to these two events that I just mentioned, both of them having to deal with the question of sexuality? I think that in our culture, part of what's happening is we are taking it onto ourselves to decide what is sacred and decide the nature of that sacred domain. And what do I mean by sacred? When we are dealing in reality, when we're experiencing the world and we're acting and perceiving, we have to make assumptions about a lot of things because for one reason, we are very limited. We don't have 100% intelligence. We can't see all around us. Our body limits what we can do in this world. And so we can't know everything. And because we can't know everything, but we still have the problem of having to act and decide, well, we have to make judgment calls and decisions. And those assumptions that we make may not necessarily be true in the absolute sense, but they could be true in a pragmatic sense. And so if something's absolutely true, I don't even know what that means. It might be something that's incomprehensible to humans, but it could be something like, an absolute truth is something that's universally true all the time, no matter what. Maybe mathematic truths come the closest to that. But if we accept that humans are inherently limited as a first assumption, as something that's first true, well, then it could make sense that we can never really get to what is absolutely true. Here's an example of what I'm trying to say here. Imagine a picture of a flower. Just imagine a flower with its colors, whatever colors, however you want to imagine it. Now, imagine that a bee comes to look at that flower as well. So we have two visual interpretations of the flower. There's yours, and then there's the bee's. Because of the differences in our physiology, in part, the bee will see certain colors of the flower that you can't see, that a human can't see. So the question becomes, well, which visual interpretation of the flower is correct? Well, we could say that both of those interpretations are assumptions, and they're both correct. They're correct in the sense that they enable the conscious observers, so the human or the bee, to do what it is they need to do. The flower reality could be thought of as latent information that manifests itself as an experience when a conscious organism brings their motivated attention to bear onto it. So if we accept that reality is something like chaotic latent information that manifests itself when you attend to it, then hopefully that kind of clarifies some of the metaphysical presuppositions that have to do with absolute truth versus pragmatic truth. We don't see the whole flower. We can't see what the bee sees, even though what the bee sees clearly has something to do with the flower. We see what we need to see in order to make our way in the world. And so our visual interpretation of that flower, for example, is an assumption. And that doesn't mean that assumptions can be arbitrary or they're relative. There are better and worse assumptions, and you can measure the goodness of an assumption insofar as it allows you to attain your goal. So that's a distinction between absolute truths, which I don't think we can get at, and pragmatic truths, which I do think that we utilize. There are some pragmatic truths that have been with us for years, millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. And I think that sex is one of those pragmatic truths. There are sponges that reproduce sexually and they don't have a nervous system, and they have embodied behavioral knowledge about the distinction between men and women, between male and female, I should say. And so that makes the embodied pragmatic truth of sex at least hundreds of millions of years old. And that knowledge, to the degree that our species, that life has been able to continue, particularly sexually reproducing life, that embodied knowledge, which at some point becomes abstracted into images and then words, and then we can say things like male and female, that truth is sacred. And I think that part of what's happening in our culture, that's been happening maybe for the past few decades, I would say, we are taking it upon ourselves to mess with the sacred. And the result of that, particularly as we are doing it in a hubristic and self-centered way, we are creating conflict and friction, social friction, and we are less and less able to communicate with each other. It's more like we're speaking different languages, whether it's politically, culturally, religiously, socially. It's getting harder to communicate. And so what should be done about that? I think part of what needs to be done about that is a reorientation towards humility and understanding that we just can't understand some things, and there are some things that have worked for, in terms of pragmatic truths, for millions of years that maybe we should respect and we should honor, for lack of better terms. And I also think that along with humility, we need a shared story. We need to inhabit an understanding of what it is as a culture, as the West, maybe as America, we could say, that we're trying to do. What is it we want for our kids? What is it that we want for the future? We need a shared vision of what constitutes better. And once we have that goal that we can all unify under, then we can discuss some of the engineering problems, the logistical problems, like how do we get there? What is the best way to move forward? So those are my thoughts on that. Appreciate you guys listening to the video, and I will see you in the next one.